Hi, my name is Alex Mohagan and I'm a cemetery enthusiast and researcher. Eventually, I will not introduce myself at the beginning of these videos, but seeing as this is only my second YouTube video, it seemed appropriate. So I gained a lot of my following by doing cemetery content on TikTok, and I decided I would move it on over here to YouTube, both because it allows me to make much longer videos, but also because TikTok has some problems. So on TikTok, one of the questions I get asked most often is, how did you get into all of this? It's a kind of vague question, but I'll try to give y'all a precise answer. So to start off, I think there's a misconception that some people hold that I am officially affiliated with a cemetery, like I'm the owner or the caretaker, and nope. I'm not. There's also some people who mistakenly believe that I am an archaeologist or an anthropologist or a professional historian. Also, nope. I actually own and operate an indie soap and perfume company. That's my day job. And all the cemetery stuff is really just a product of me being curious. I like to learn things, and then I like to tell other people the stuff that I learned. I'm probably closest to a journalist, which actually makes a lot of sense because I have a writing and journalism background. This is just journalism with my mouth instead of my hands, which is a weird way to put that. So my interest in cemeteries, let's talk about that. I hate to say that I've just kind of always enjoyed cemeteries, but I can't remember when it started. So I'm just gonna assume I was born this way. But for real, when I was younger, I remember driving past a cemetery on the school bus and somebody saying that we should hold our breath. And I was a very contrary child, so I was just like, and I think in the same way, I refused to be told that cemeteries were scary. I was like, yeah, well, I'm gonna go in them anyhow. I suspect that was maybe part of it. I know also that I have always had a fondness for religious iconography because I was raised basically agnostic by a pair of parents who used to go to church, but by the time me and my siblings were around, we didn't anymore. So all of that stuff was really interesting to me because I didn't know what it was. Later on, I kind of turned into a bit of a goth, so hanging out in cemeteries was like A+ activity right there. But there was a moment that I remember having in high school where I was visiting a cemetery that I think probably cemented them as feeling like a very safe place for me personally. I've dealt with episodes of depression since I was in middle school, and at some point I realized that if I really needed to cry, a cemetery was a really good place to do that. Like, honestly, nobody is gonna come up to some girl crying in the cemetery and be like, what the fuck's your problem? So it became a really safe place for me to go when I was feeling upset or emotional, and it's kind of remained that way ever since. So that is the enthusiast part of when I say I'm a cemetery enthusiast and researcher. And I think people really want to know, how did I get involved in the research part? So a couple of years ago, my interest in cemeteries had grown to the point where I was regularly seeking out new cemeteries to go visit. I had definitely gotten to the point where if I was driving somewhere and I happened to pass some little country cemetery, I would 100% whip a Yui on a farmer's driveway to go back and check it out. But like many people growing up under the shadow of capitalism, I started to feel bad that I was spending so much time doing something that was really enjoyable, but it didn't make me any money. So I thought, maybe I could write a book? Like, that would work. Then visiting cemeteries would be research, and I could do tons of that. But I didn't think that Girl Visits Cemetery, Enjoys Self was a particularly captivating idea for a book. So I thought, well, what if I made it like, I'm gonna visit every cemetery in the United States? And I was like, no, no. I was like, okay. What if I visited every cemetery in Wisconsin, the state that I live in? I was like, that might work. It would take a really long time, but that just means that I would have an excuse for like the next 10 years to visit any cemetery that I wanted. Yeah, let's do that. So I figured I would be reasonable and start with all of the cemeteries that were closest to me. I went over to findagrave.com, and they have a feature where you can browse all of the cemeteries in a given county. So I pulled that up, typed in Chippewa County, and found every cemetery that was within like basically an hour's drive of me. I started making a little customized Google map so that I could just hop in the car and like pick a cemetery and be navigated straight toward it. I'm like, this is the best idea I've ever had. Now, most of the cemeteries I didn't recognize or know where they were because Chippewa County is pretty rural. There's a lot of farmland, which means that there's a lot of like little family cemeteries, and there's a lot of cemeteries that just I would never have any reason to accidentally drive by. So when I saw the name Chippewa County Poor Farm Cemetery, I assumed it was just another one that was going to be out in the country somewhere. Thinking back, I don't think I had a good idea of what a poor farm was, and I think in my head I just sort of had assumed that poor was actually somebody's last name. Like in my area, this is actually a last name, so it was not an unreasonable thought. But when I plunked my little star on my Google map, I realized that this cemetery was like within town. Like it was right next to the hospital where I had had my kids. It was down the street from the chiropractor that I saw every other week. I was like, how the fuck did I not ever see this place? What the hell? So I'm on Google Maps, I switch it to satellite view, and sure enough, you can see rows of headstones, and I'm like, what? So I remember it was like 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. I had work the next day, but I'm like, I'm gonna go and look for it right now. So I hop in the car, I drove up there, and I couldn't find it. So I went back home and I just started researching. So that night I learned 3 things that kind of blew my mind a little bit. The first thing was that, yeah, the cemetery had been there since like 1901, that it was indeed right next to the hospital where I'd had my kids, and that it had just been there the entire time. And that was enough to be just deeply shocking for me, because I was under the impression that I knew where all the cemeteries in town were because I would visit them regularly. And this one was just like sitting there the entire time. I had no idea. So that was a shock. The second thing that surprised me was that this cemetery had been servicing 3 different institutions that I didn't know we had had. I take that back. I knew about one, but I didn't know about the other 2. So the first was the Poor Farm, which it's named after. And that was basically a place for people who couldn't afford to support themselves to go and live. The second was once upon a time called the Home for the Feeble-Minded, which is a real bad term that we should never use. Basically a county home for people with developmental disabilities. That's the one I knew about because a modern version of that still exists in town. And the third institution was an asylum. I had no idea that we had had one in town. And the third thing I learned that night explains why I had no idea that this cemetery was there until I stumbled upon it. At some point after the last burial in 1965, the city sort of forgot. We stopped maintaining it as a city. Like nobody was mowing the grass, nobody was taking care of anything. It was just kind of left to fend for itself, which meant that the stones sank into the ground, everything got overgrown, and people forgot completely that there was even a cemetery there. Obviously not everybody forgot, but we will get to that in a future video. The cemetery was rediscovered in 2008 when a maintenance worker named Mike Wegner.
His last name is actually Winsher. I'm so sorry, Mike. BRB, gonna bury myself alive.
Hit what he thought was a rock with his riding lawnmower, and it turned out that nope, it was a headstone. Side note, I am so glad that Mike was the one who found the headstone, because he also ended up spearheading a lot of the renovation that happened there, and I kind of shudder to think what would have happened if it hadn't been somebody like Mike. So, you know, just me fangirling over here about you, Mike. You're a classy dude. So that kind of explains why I didn't know this cemetery was there, despite being just like a cemetery fanatic and being at every single one that I could find in town. Because, hey, it kind of wasn't a place you could visit until 2008. And it just so happens that in 2008, I wasn't living in Chippewa Falls. I was living one town over for a little window. So I didn't hear about the discovery and I didn't hear about the renovation, because you best believe if I had known about it, I'd have been all up in that stuff. So as I said, I had tried to go up and find the cemetery that night, but it was dark and I couldn't see, and I thought, that's probably why. Turns out there was more of a reason for why I couldn't find it. So for one, there's no signage. There's nothing that you can see from the road that will tell you that, hey, there's a cemetery if you turn right here. Second, the road you take down to the cemetery is the little road that is behind a bunch of healthcare facility buildings. So it's like where the dumpsters are, and it doesn't look like it leads anywhere that you're really supposed to be if you don't work there. third, because all of the headstones are set down into the ground, you really can't see it from a distance unless you know what you're looking for. There are 2 markers talking about the cemetery. One is, I believe, from the Wisconsin State Historical Society. We have them all over the place. They're a little brown house-looking wooden thing. Unfortunately, that sign mostly talks about the institutions that were servicing this cemetery rather than the cemetery or the people in it themselves. The other marker is from our local historical society, and the stuff that's written on that marker is really what motivated me to start digging into the history of this cemetery, and specifically the histories of the people buried in it. The marker is very nice, and I don't want to denigrate it, but one of the things that they talk about is that as you look at the headstones in this cemetery, you'll notice that there are no dates. Basically, every marker just has a name, and then it has a row number and a grave number, and that's it. They follow up that statement on this dedication marker by saying many of the people buried here would have spent their entire lives at one of these institutions. And it really comes off to me personally as excusing that lack of information, that, well, we didn't have to write down when they were born or when they died because they were just in the same place the entire time, so like, that's okay. I did not think that that was okay. I got really mad about it. Once I started researching the people buried there, I found that there were plenty of cases where people had had very long, full, very socially engaged lives in the community and had only wound up at one of these institutions for the last maybe couple of years of their life. And in many cases, it was the last few months of their life. And so to weirdly reduce all the people buried there down into where they wound up at the very end of their lives seemed really fucking gross. It's just awful. It seemed like such a shitty thing to do. And especially to a group of people who we know had already been a marginalized group. Either they were poor, or they were disabled, or they were suffering from a mental illness that we probably could treat these days, but we couldn't back then. Now, there are some people, even today, for whom being in a facility is one of the safest things for them. You know, they can get round-the-clock care. Maybe they don't have family who can help care for them, and without this kind of support, they're going to just be out on the streets and having a really, really awful life. I don't want to say that being in a facility for your entire life is an inherently bad thing, because I don't think it is in all cases. However, number one, brushing those people sort of under the rug and saying like, oh, we don't need to do any kind of research, we don't need to make any notes about these people because they were just broken from the start and they were just in this home their entire lives, the poor things, but they're not really people. That's, to me, how it's being treated. But then to add on to that, that anybody who was in this institution for any length of time also, yeah, no, that just erases your entire life up until that point, because sorry, you died poor, or sorry, you died with dementia. Sorry, you died because you had epilepsy. So basically I got really mad, y'all. I got really, really angry. And I don't know whether other people in my town would react to this idea the same way that I did, but I honestly felt like the city was not taking enough responsibility for what happened. That number one, these people should have been buried more respectfully from the start, and number two, we should not pretend like we didn't have something to do with that. Like, this is not just a natural phenomenon that happened. This was a series of choices, probably based in money. You know, this is just me thinking aloud here, but it was probably cheaper to not have any dates on there. So that's where this all started. That's where I started going, you know what? I bet you I could research some of these people and find out more information about them to prove my point. And I did. And I made a whole bunch of TikToks talking about it. And then TikTok started to suck, so here we are. So yeah, it was basically the research that I was doing at the Poor Farm Cemetery, trying to learn more about these people, that got me started doing that kind of research, like, period. I got very used to using sites like Ancestry and Family Search and newspapers.com and things like that to try to dig into these little histories, these little stories of just average people who still had really fucking interesting lives. And from there, I started looking into all sorts of other cemeteries and different burial practices, and I got compared to Caitlin Doughty an awful lot. I think it's the bangs. I am most certainly going to keep on talking about the Poor Farm Cemetery and some of my research there because I have a ton of stories about the people buried there, and some of them are so fucking interesting and I just love them. My goal when it comes to that cemetery in particular is to make the people there three-dimensional. I want people to understand that they were complex, real people who had actual lives, who had actual thoughts and feelings, not just the sad remains that we have right now. Obviously, I'm not gonna just be talking about the Poor Farm Cemetery here. I'm gonna probably be talking about a lot of other cemeteries, plus just general cemetery stuff, like, hey, what's it mean when there's a book on the headstone like that? Say, have you ever noticed there's a lot of crosses in this cemetery, but not so many in that one over there? Oh shit, there's a marker made of metal. What's up with that? Because that's the kind of stuff that I like, so I'll probably end up talking about it. And who knows, maybe at some point I'll get a marker put up at the Poor Farm Cemetery explaining some of the stuff that I've been trying to learn. As I said before, I love learning things and I love telling people the things that I've learned, but I also love when I get questions because I want to know what you guys want to know about. I am happy to research on your behalf. So if you've got any questions or there's something specific you want to see me talk about, please don't hesitate to leave a comment. And if you're here from TikTok, you can leave a comment that's something like, CEO of leaving one social media platform for another. I'm gonna go now because I am very, very warm. Like my glasses won't stay on my face, they're just slowly sliding down. I will see you all soon. Hopefully everybody is having an awesome day. Stay safe. Okay, bye. Farmer's Driveway, I just gotta remember Farmer's Driveway. How many times can I say county? I'm probably closest to a journalist, which makes some sense. Ooh, motorcycle, stop driving by my house. Grr. I can't close my window because I'll die. I'm so hot, oh my god.